Rashad Ellison walked into AP Math on his first day, and the room went silent. Not because he was new, but because he was black. The white professor scanned him like a mistake, then smirked, and wrote an impossible equation on the board. A trap, one designed specifically for Rashad to fail. But when Rashad solved it, what happened next shocked the entire school. The teacher tore up the proof in front of everyone. Why? Because Rashad wasn't just right. He had just exposed a lie, bigger than anyone was ready to face. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The late September sun hung low over the tree-lined campus of Dunham Preparatory Academy, its golden light spilling across marble columns and ivy-covered brick. This was a school built on legacy, and legacy alone. Old money, old families, and names that opened doors before they were even uttered. That morning, amid the polished Oxfords and monogrammed backpacks, walked Rashad Ellison. His backpack was second-hand, his shoes were scuffed but clean, and his eyes scanned every detail of the school like a soldier entering unfamiliar terrain. Rashad was 15, tall for his age, with skin the color of warm mahogany, and an intellect honed sharper than most college seniors. But none of that mattered here. He wasn't the kind of student Dunham usually displayed in its recruitment pamphlets. Sure, he had perfect grades, national math competition medals, and had even contributed to a published theory on combinatorics at the age of 13. But when he stepped into room 304 for his AP mathematics class, it was as if none of that existed. The moment he opened the door, a silence settled like dust in the air. It wasn't dramatic. It was surgical. Eyes glanced, then lingered. Subtle whispers danced between manicured students. A girl with perfect posture nudged her friend and nodded toward Rashad like he was a glitch in their polished simulation. The teacher hadn't even noticed him yet, or at least pretended not to. Rashad moved toward the back of the room and sat in the only empty seat, which seemed more like an intentional omission than coincidence. The air smelled of whiteboard cleaner and entitlement. Dr. Lewis Harding finally turned from his desk. A tall man in his 60s, his hair the color of chalk, he had an air of practiced prestige. He taught at Dunham not because he needed to, but because it kept him relevant in academic circles. He'd once been a math prodigy himself, decades ago, but now he taught with the kind of arrogance only possible when no one dares question your authority. His eyes landed on Rashad. He scanned him for a moment too long. Rashad met his gaze without flinching, but inside he felt something tighten. It wasn't the usual first-day nerves. It was recognition. He'd seen that stare before. In competitions where judges second-guessed his work. At lectures where professors assumed he was a guest, not a speaker. That look said, "You don't belong here, and I'm going to prove it." "Name?" Dr. Harding asked, already knowing it. "Rashad Ellison," he replied, steady and clear. A few students turned to look at him again. One boy smirked. Harding nodded slowly, almost reluctantly. "You're the scholarship student." It wasn't a question. Rashad simply nodded once. "Well," Harding said, turning back toward the board, "I hope you're ready to be challenged." The words weren't threatening on their surface, but the undertone was unmistakable. Rashad had been warned by his older cousin, who once tried a similar path. At schools like Dunham, excellence doesn't protect you, it threatens them. The class droned on for 30 minutes, most of it administrative. Harding handed out syllabi and set expectations. But Rashad noticed that the professor never asked him a single question, didn't even glance in his direction, as he called on students. It wasn't an oversight, it was control. Then, something changed. Harding capped the marker he had been using, and paused, tapping the board twice. "Let's do something different," he said, walking slowly to the far end of the whiteboard. "Something challenging." The class perked up slightly, sensing this wasn't part of the lesson plan. Harding began writing. The marker squeaked as a string of symbols unfolded. Set theory, modular arithmetic, elements of graph theory, high-level concepts stitched into a Frankenstein equation that looked intimidating, even to advanced students. It was sprawling, unfamiliar, and purposely convoluted. Rashad sat up straight. He recognized a few fragments immediately. But something felt off. Not just in the structure, but in the intention. "This," Harding said, capping the marker with a faint smirk, "is an equation from a graduate-level seminar I attended in Berlin. It's unsolved." I wouldn't expect anyone here to crack it. His eyes briefly flicked to Rashad. But I'm always open to surprises. The room was quiet. The other students scribbled the problem into their notebooks out of obligation. Rashad didn't move. He kept staring at the board. He didn't need a full hour. He didn't even need a calculator. What he needed was confirmation, and he had it. The equation wasn't just advanced. It was intentionally flawed. There was a contradiction baked into its core, a mathematical paradox so subtle that anyone without a trained eye would assume they were the ones misunderstanding it. But Rashad saw it. Dr. Harding had created a trap. Not for the whole class, for him. Because only someone as smart as Rashad would spot it. And if he called it out, Harding would paint him as arrogant, disruptive and wrong. If he stayed silent, he'd be complicit in his own erasure. Rashad picked up his pen, but he wasn't solving. He was rewriting. Not just the problem but the intention behind it. If Harding wanted to set a trap, then Rashad would spring it on his own terms. Across the room, Dr. Harding watched him from the corner of his eye, lips curving into something too calm. And then with casual precision he said, "Class, let's take this home. Whoever gets the furthest, we'll review tomorrow. That'll separate the students from the enthusiasts." There it was again, another jab cloaked as motivation. The bell rang, chairs scraped against tile. Students filtered out, chatting about nothing important. Rashad stayed seated for a moment. The equation burned into his mind. He didn't feel challenged. He felt hunted, but he also felt ready. He stood slowly, picked up his notebook, and walked toward the door. As he stepped past the whiteboard, he saw Harding staring at him. "Good luck," the professor said, voice smooth as glass. "You'll need it." Rashad didn't reply, but he didn't break eye contact either. And as he walked out, the marker squeaked again behind him. Harding was already drawing the next trap. Rashad sat in silence as the classroom emptied around him. The equation still stretched across the whiteboard like a battlefield map, symbols tangled like barbed wire, Greek letters clashing with obscure notations. He memorized it, every fragment. He didn't write it down because he didn't need to. It was already imprinted in his mind, seared there by instinct and suspicion. Dr. Harding had dismissed the class with his usual coolness, but his final glance at Rashad lingered a moment too long. That glance wasn't just a challenge, it was a warning. He wanted Rashad to try. Not because he expected brilliance, but because he wanted Rashad to fail. Visibly, publicly. As Rashad exited the building, the late afternoon sun stung his eyes. But the air felt colder than it should have. Around him, students spilled out laughing, texting, making weekend plans. A group of them passed by him, their voices carrying loud enough to be overheard but not addressed. You see his face when Harding dropped that problem? Bet he's already Googling it. Not that it'll help. Rashad didn't look at them. He just walked faster. But something in his chest was burning now. Not rage, not fear, something sharper. Purpose. At home, Rashad's room looked like a command center. Whiteboards covered in equations, books stacked in uneven towers, a cracked laptop humming quietly. His mother worked late most nights at the hospital. The silence of the apartment gave him space, but it also echoed with old warnings. Warnings about being twice as good, about staying humble, about how black boys didn't get second chances. But tonight wasn't about survival. It was about clarity. He dropped his bag, cracked his knuckles, and wrote the equation across his own board, symbol by symbol. At first he treated it like any other high-level proof, breaking it down into segments, simplifying where he could, mapping variables. But as he moved deeper, his eyes narrowed. There was a fracture. At line 4, where the matrix was supposed to balance, it didn't. Not because Rashad misunderstood, but because the equation itself was flawed. Subtly, purposefully, it was crafted to almost work, enough to trap an eager student into chasing a false solution. And then, once you reached the contradiction, it would seem like your mistake. A lesser student would question themselves. A student like Rashad would see the game. His jaw tightened. Harding hadn't miscalculated. He'd built a weapon. That realization hit harder than any insult. It wasn't just about math. It was about control. The problem wasn't a challenge. It was sabotage. A message. You're not welcome here. But Rashad wasn't just smart. He was creative. That's what made him different. That's what Harding didn't understand. So Rashad didn't stop at identifying the contradiction. He reimagined the equation entirely. For hours he tore it apart and rebuilt it. this time with integrity and logic instead of deception. He didn't just correct it, he elevated it, creating a proof that not only solved the intended premise, but exposed the flaw Harding had inserted. By 2:17 a.m., he stepped back from his whiteboard. His legs ached, his vision blurred. But the solution was there. Elegant, clear, real. He printed the pages, 7 in total, carefully numbered and annotated. His handwriting was meticulous. At the top he wrote, "Alternate solution to Dr. Harding's equation, R. Ellison." No flourish, no ego, just truth. The next morning, Dunham's hallways buzzed as usual. Rashad walked through them unnoticed, carrying a manila folder. He wasn't nervous, not yet, but there was a weight in his stomach. A quiet storm of anticipation. Not fear, something colder, something that knew what was coming. In room 304, Harding stood at the board again, discussing number theory with performative ease. Rashad took his seat. His proof rested quietly in his lap. Harding didn't acknowledge him. At the end of class, as students began to gather their things, Rashad stood, calmly, quietly. He walked to the front of the room, folder in hand. Harding turned, eyes narrowing. "Yes, I finished the problem," Rashad said, offering the folder. Harding looked at it, not moving. Other students paused at the door. Some lingered. Harding finally reached out and took the folder. He flipped it open. His eyes scanned the first page, then the second. A flicker of something passed across his face. Not confusion. Recognition. He turned back to Rashad. "This is creative," he said, voice controlled. "But I don't recall asking for an alternate solution." Rashad didn't respond. Harding's gaze drifted across the class, noticing the students who had stopped to watch. Then in one fluid motion, he tore the folder in half. Gasps echoed through the room. The pages fluttered to the ground like leaves. "You were supposed to attempt the problem," Harding said coldly. "Not invent your own mathematics." Rashad stood frozen. The silence was heavy, nauseating. A girl near the front whispered, "What the hell?" Harding looked down at the shredded proof. "This isn't the place for showmanship," he said. "This is an institution of discipline and rigor, not creativity for its own sake." Rashad's fists clenched at his sides, not in anger, but in containment. He couldn't respond. Not now, not here. That was the real test. Harding wasn't just challenging his math skills. He was baiting him into an emotional explosion. But Rashad gave him nothing. He turned, walked back to his seat. The class watched in stunned silence. Then, as if it never happened, Harding returned to his lecture. But Rashad's mind was already somewhere else, because he remembered something from the night before. A detail he hadn't noticed at first. While researching similar problems, he had come across a Russian math journal from 1976. A nearly identical equation appeared in its archives, one dismissed at the time for being unsolvable due to a fundamental contradiction. The exact contradiction Harding had built into his own problem. Rashad's stomach dropped. Harding hadn't just set him up to fail. He had plagiarized, copied a buried problem from an obscure journal, tweaked it slightly, and presented it as his own. He wasn't trying to test anyone. He was protecting his ego. Rashad gathered the shredded papers silently and placed them back into his bag. The damage was done, but something had shifted. He now had something more powerful than proof. He had a pattern and a plan. That afternoon, Rashad printed the 1976 Soviet paper, highlighting the original flawed equation, and realized Dr. Harding hadn't just copied it. He'd signed his name at the bottom when he submitted it to the State Math Council last year. The pages hit the floor like dead weight, the torn edges curling slightly, as if recoiling from the act of violence. The silence in room 3 was so thick it made sound itself feel disrespectful. Students froze mid-step, mid-whisper, as the final page of Rashad's proof slid across the tile toward the radiator. Dr. Harding stood over the remnants like a surgeon who had just discarded a failed organ. His face was unreadable, but his intent had already detonated. "This," he said, gesturing to the torn mess, "is not mathematics. This is fiction." A nervous ripple of laughter stuttered through the classroom. It wasn't amusement. It was fear dressed in conformity. Harding's authority didn't invite disagreement. It demanded obedience, and no one wanted to be the next target. Rashad didn't move. He didn't speak. He couldn't. Every part of him was still catching up to what had just happened. He'd known the trap was set. He'd walked into it willingly, but he hadn't expected the strike to be this brutal, this public, this complete. The laughter stung, not because of the sound, but because of the complicity inside it. Harding turned his back to the class, erasing the board with slow, methodical strokes, as if nothing had occurred, as if Rashad's intellect, his labor, his proof were just a mess to be wiped away. I encourage you all, Harding said, still facing the board, to keep your ideas within the structure of logic. Creativity has its place, but not when it distorts the rules we rely on. Rashad blinked. The room swam slightly. Someone coughed. A girl near the window stole a glance at him, then looked away just as fast. He bent down, collected the pieces of his work without looking up. His hands moved slowly, deliberately, each torn page a quiet reminder of the truth. This place wasn't just difficult, it was hostile. And worse, it was polished enough to convince others it wasn't. When the bell rang, Rashad walked out of the classroom like a shadow. No one spoke to him. Not even the ones who had gasped. By the time he reached his locker, the rage had settled into something deeper. It wasn't just anger, it was betrayal. He had come to Dunham to grow, to push himself against the best minds he could find. But what he'd found was a system that dressed racism in academia's finest robes, and called it tradition. That evening, he skipped dinner. He pulled out his laptop, opened 3 browsers, and dove into Dr. Harding's career. The man had been a figure in the math world for decades. Conference speaker, journal contributor, even a guest lecturer at Yale. But Rashad wasn't interested in Harding's glory. He was looking for his fingerprints. He searched through old archives, obscure math forums, translated PDFs from Russian university repositories. It took hours. Midnight came and went. The only light in his room came from the screen, glowing faintly against his exhausted eyes. And then he found it. Matematikiski Zapiski, Issue 3, 1976. A Soviet math journal, buried on page 47, was a proof that mirrored Harding's classroom equation, almost line for line. Except in its original form, it had been presented as a theoretical flaw, a mathematical what-if, demonstrating the dangers of misapplied set logic. It was never meant to be solved. It was meant to expose failure. Harding hadn't just stolen a problem. He'd weaponized it. Rashad's breath caught. He zoomed in, screenshot the proof, then dug deeper. He traced Harding's 2022 lecture submission to the State Math Educators Conference. It was the same equation, presented as his own. Slight adjustments to variables, notations tweaked just enough to avoid obvious comparison, but the skeleton was identical. And Harding had signed his name at the bottom. For a moment, Rashad just stared at the screen. This wasn't just petty sabotage anymore. It was fraud. It was theft. And no one had caught it, because no one had ever been expected to look. He sat back in his chair, mind racing. If he exposed this, it wouldn't just clear his name. It could destroy Harding's. Every accolade, every journal, every board position, at risk. But that wasn't what weighed on Rashad most. It was the silence he'd seen in the classroom. The way the students had laughed, the way the administration would likely handle it. Quietly, protectively, coldly, he printed the Soviet paper, highlighting the matching equation. He slid it into the same manila folder he had used the day before, the same one Harding had torn. But now he hesitated. The choice in front of him wasn't simple. Expose Harding and risk being labeled vindictive, disruptive, a liar playing the race card. Stay silent and let the system continue, untouched, unquestioned. He thought of his mother, working double shifts just to keep him at Dunham. He thought of his cousin, who dropped out of a similar school after a teacher told him he was too street smart for real science. He thought of every eye that had turned away when Harding humiliated him. And then he thought of the proof. His proof that could have changed the equation for everyone. As Rashad folded the folder shut, preparing to act, his phone buzzed, an anonymous message with a screenshot of his torn proof, and the caption, "Welcome to Dunham. You don't get to win." The message stayed on Rashad's phone screen, long after the glow faded from his laptop. "Welcome to Dunham. You don't get to win." The words weren't just a threat. They were a sentence. A reminder that this wasn't about one proof or one humiliation. It was about control, narrative, power. He stared at it for a long minute, then slowly placed the phone face down. The next morning, Dunham's manicured walkways and brick corridors felt tighter somehow. More watchful. Rashad could feel the walls leaning in. It wasn't paranoia, it was precision, subtle, steady. And it began the moment he stepped into room 3. Dr. Harding was already at the board. dry erase marker clicking between his fingers like a metronome. The lesson was pure routine. Calculus review. Nothing unusual. But when Harding handed back graded problem sets from the week before, Rashad noticed something impossible. He'd received a 7. He blinked. That problem set had been flawless. He'd triple-checked every calculation, referenced theorems, even color-coded his logic chains. At the bottom of the page, a single comment in Harding's precise handwriting, sloppy reasoning in line 3b. Recheck approach. Rashad flipped back to line 3. There was nothing wrong. He raised his hand. Dr. Harding? The professor didn't turn around. We're moving forward, Rashad. I just had a question about the…
We're moving forward, he repeated, this time louder.
Rashad lowered his hand. Around him, a few students exchanged glances. No one spoke. It was the start of a pattern. By the end of the week, his test scores dropped again, 69%, then 71%. Always with vague comments, lack of clarity, underdeveloped logic, and yet the calculations were correct. The logic intact, but that wasn't the point. It wasn't about correctness. It was about rewriting his value. In group projects, Rashad noticed the shift too. No one wanted to partner with him. A girl he'd shared notes with the week before now acted like she didn't know his name. During lab work, he was ignored. When he tried to speak, his voice felt like background noise. Then came the locker. It happened on a Wednesday. Rashad had stayed late to finish a stats assignment in the library. When he returned to grab his books, he noticed something was off. His locker was slightly ajar. Inside, his textbooks were torn. His proof pages, copied backups, had been defaced with red ink. Cheater. Fraud. Not genius. Just black. The last words had been scratched in bold, jagged letters across the inside of the door. His breath hitched. He didn't move. Didn't yell. Just stared at the damage. It was the quietest kind of violence. Deliberate. Designed to make him implode without spectacle. He reported it to the office. The next day, the locker had been cleaned. No suspects. No follow-up. Just silence. That afternoon, Rashad walked into the counselor's office. Ms. Linden was in her 40s, always dressed in earth tones and soft scarves, the kind of person who seemed endlessly calm. But as he sat down and laid the printed Soviet paper on her desk, her expression shifted. I believe Dr. Harding plagiarized this equation, Rashad said calmly, evenly. It matches his submission to the state council. This journal predates it by over 4 decades. Mrs. Linden glanced over the documents, nodding slowly. I've also been receiving failing marks without clear cause, he added, and my locker was vandalized. She folded her hands gently. Rashad, I understand this must feel incredibly frustrating. He waited. But I want you to consider the possibility, she continued, that this environment might feel more hostile than it actually is, because of the pressure you're under. Rashad's jaw clenched. I'm not imagining slurs on my locker, he said. I don't doubt that something happened, she said quickly. Unless someone witnessed it, there's not much we can do. And as for the grade drops, maybe Dr. Harding is pushing you harder because he sees potential. Rashad stared at her. She was smiling. It was a smile wrapped in sympathy, coded in dismissal. He collected the papers. Thank you for your time, he said coldly. She nodded. We're here to support you. As he left her office, something inside him shifted. Not broke, shifted. Hardened. He stopped expecting help from anyone. By Friday, the isolation was total. Even students who'd once nodded hello now avoided his gaze. He became a ghost with skin, a name no one wanted to say aloud. His work was no longer about learning. It was survival, proof of existence. He stopped attending club meetings, ate lunch alone in the far courtyard behind the science wing. The air out there was colder, but at least it was honest. But the system wasn't done yet. That afternoon, after the final bell, Dr. Harding called out across the classroom. Ellison, stay behind. The room cleared. Rashad didn't sit. He stood at the edge of the desks, spine straight. Harding finished wiping the board, then turned slowly. He looked almost amused. You're clever, he said. Too clever sometimes. Rashad said nothing. Harding stepped closer, his voice dropping in tone. You think because you can do equations, he said, that makes you invincible? Rashad's eyes stayed locked on his. But this place, Harding continued, tapping his chest with a piece of chalk, wasn't built for boys like you. And deep down, you know that. Rashad's hands were at his sides, fingers tight. I've seen your type before. Think you're exceptional. Think you'll change the world? Harding leaned in slightly. You won't. Rashad's throat tightened, but his voice remained level. You're scared of me, he said. Harding blinked once. You built a fake problem to make me doubt myself, Rashad added. And I solved it anyway. Harding smiled faintly. You still think this is about math? He stepped back, brushing chalk from his sleeve. You can't win, he said, eyes cold. Not here. Rashad turned to leave, but froze as he saw someone outside the door, listening. A janitor, one he'd never noticed before, watching in silence, eyes locked with his, as if he knew exactly what had just happened, and had seen it all before. The janitor's eyes lingered long after Rashad left the room. They hadn't spoken, hadn't exchanged a single word. But in that one look, something passed between them. Recognition, quiet solidarity, and something deeper, confirmation. Rashad wasn't crazy, he was being watched, tested, and slowly erased. That night, Rashad didn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling in the dark, letting the silence of the apartment fold around him. His mind worked in spirals, thoughts tangling with strategy, with fury, with vision. He was up against something far larger than a man named Harding. He was up against a machine that punished genius when it wore the wrong skin. So he shifted, not his intellect, his tactics. Rashad spent the weekend reconstructing his proof, not the torn version Harding had mocked in class, but something new, bigger, bolder, a reinvention. He didn't just correct the stolen Soviet equation, he extended it, built a new mathematical model that bridged gaps in logic, and layered dimensional theory with graph-based abstraction. The result was so airtight, so elegant, that even he felt chills reading it. He didn't sign it. Instead, he submitted it anonymously to the Northeastern State Math League Journal, which accepted papers for peer review on a rolling basis. There were no author names, only numeric tags. It was the purest form of merit, blind, cold, unforgiving. But that's what Rashad needed, to see if truth alone could breathe through the lie. The following Monday, he returned to school as if nothing had changed. Harding barely acknowledged him in class, though Rashad caught a strange flicker in his eyes. Paranoia, maybe. As if Harding sensed something was coming but couldn't yet name it. The days passed, quiet, tense, until Thursday. Rashad walked into the library for his usual study hour, and stopped short. Students were whispering near the printer station, eyes wide, one holding a tablet like it was a winning lottery ticket. Did you see the league announcement? Dr. Harding's equation. Someone fixed it. They're calling it historic. I heard the judges thought it was written by an MIT professor. Rashad walked past them, heart pounding. He opened his laptop, fingers trembling, and pulled up the journal's site. There it was. Reconstruction and theoretical completion of Harding's contradictory set formula. Author anonymous submission. A short editorial blurb followed. This paper challenges long-held assumptions about applied set theory, and offers a revolutionary model, with implications for both mathematical theory and artificial intelligence logic. It is decades ahead of its time. His screen blurred for a second. He blinked rapidly, pulling the air into his lungs like it had weight. He had done it, but the moment was short-lived. An emergency faculty meeting was called that afternoon. The subject? The mysterious paper. The entire math department was in an uproar, not because of its brilliance, but because it had rewritten a problem previously attributed to Dunham's own Dr. Lewis Harding. Inside the conference room, tension hung like smoke. Dr. Harding stood at the head of the long mahogany table, papers in hand, brows drawn together as though confused. Whoever wrote this, he said, voice tight with faux humility, did remarkable work. But this equation is based on a structure I introduced at last year's Educators Symposium. I have the original file and timestamp. A few faculty members nodded, impressed. Others squinted at their copies, lost in the brilliance of the proof. Dr. Elaine Foster, head of the board, leaned forward. Are you suggesting the anonymous author used your framework without citation? Harding paused, then nodded gravely. It appears so. There it was. The theft. Again. Except this time. The lie was bigger. And Rashad was done being quiet. He opened the door without knocking. The room turned. Faculty blinked in surprise. A few instinctively stood, unsure what was happening. Rashad walked in slowly, calmly, holding a single copy of the printed proof. Harding's face froze. I didn't mean to interrupt, Rashad said quietly. Dr. Foster stood. Mr. Ellison. Rashad walked to the table, placed the proof down in front of her, and looked directly at Harding. That's my proof, he said. I wrote it. Silence. It spread like a virus. Harding didn't move. Dr. Foster blinked. You authored this anonymously? Rashad nodded. I submitted it to the journal using their blind review system. No name, just the work. He turned to the rest of the faculty. The equation it builds on isn't Harding's. It was published in a 1976 Soviet journal. I found it last month while researching flawed set logic. Harding took it, changed a few variables, and presented it as his own at last year's state council meeting. I can show you the original paper. Dr. Foster looked at Harding. Is that true? Harding's jaw tensed. I've never seen that journal. Rashad pulled the folded printout from his back pocket. This is it. The equation begins on page 47. Identical structure. Identical flaw. He handed it to her. She read, slowly. Her face grew pale. One of the other professors, Dr. Malik, took it from her and scanned it himself. You're right, he muttered. It's the same. Rashad turned to Harding one last time. You tried to humiliate me, he said, voice even. You mocked my work. You vandalized my reputation in front of my peers. But the numbers don't lie. I just showed you what truth looks like when it isn't hiding behind a whiteboard. Harding opened his mouth, but no words came out. Dr. Foster slowly set the papers down, looked at Harding, then back at Rashad and said, We'll need to bring this before the full board. But first, Mr. Ellison, I want to ask you something off the record. Has this kind of targeting happened before? The conference room felt smaller now, as though the walls themselves were listening. Rashad could still feel the weight of Dr. Foster's question settling in the air. Has this kind of targeting happened before? Harding's face had stiffened the moment she asked it, the corners of his jaw twitching as if the question itself were an act of betrayal. Before Rashad could answer, the door burst open.
Dean Whitmore, the school's thundering presence in polished loafers and outdated prestige, strode in. His hair silver and immovable, seemed carved from the same stone as Dunham's front gate. Behind him came 3 more administrators, including Vice Principal Aldridge, whose first priority was always reputation, never truth.
We'll handle this, Whitmore said curtly, cutting off Foster before she could speak again. Harding instantly relaxed, shoulders dropping, as though his reinforcements had finally arrived. Rashad remained still. Whitmore took the head of the table, not asking permission. I've been informed we have a serious accusation being made against one of our longest-standing faculty members. Dr. Foster began. Dean Whitmore. I think you should see. Whitmore raised a hand sharply. I don't need to see anything yet. His gaze swept to Rashad. Son, accusations like this are severe. You must understand the damage they can cause. Rashad's voice remained calm. I have evidence. The Soviet paper. We're not discussing foreign publications, Whitmore interrupted with a dismissive wave, as though the existence of math printed in another language made it invalid. We're discussing your behavior.
My behavior?
Rashad repeated, incredulous. Whitmore nodded slowly, leaning back in his seat. Yes, Dr. Harding has informed us that you have been exhibiting troubling patterns, erratic claims, fixation on disproving assignments, boundary pushing. Harding played his part perfectly. I've tried to be patient, he said, wearing an expression of forced concern. But Rashad seems to believe I'm targeting him personally. He fabricated a story about a Soviet manuscript. His academic performance has declined, and I suspect the pressure has become too much. Rashad stared at him, stunned. My academic performance hasn't declined. You lowered my grades without cause. A sharp voice cut through the air. That's not what our system shows, Vice Principal Aldridge said, flipping open a tablet. Your recent test scores are uncharacteristically low. And we also found suspicious logins to the teacher portal from your student IP. Perhaps you were trying to adjust grades? Rashad's chest tightened. I never accessed. Why would I hack the grade system? I wasn't the one changing anything. Whitmore folded his hands. The system flags don't lie, son. Rashad felt the breath leave his body. But you never checked who altered the grades. You only checked the alert. Foster tried to interject. It's entirely possible the system auto-flagged unusual patterns. We shouldn't jump. But the faculty had already aligned themselves. Truth didn't matter here. Hierarchy did. Harding looked at Whitmore, then at the table of teachers who had silently assembled behind him. I want to make something very clear, he said calmly. I have not stolen anything. I have never plagiarized, and I am deeply concerned that this young man is inventing stories to undermine an assignment he struggled with. The room exhaled. some in relief, some in subtle agreement. Rashad felt like he was dissolving in plain sight. He tried again. The equation you wrote is identical to the problem from the night. Enough, Whitmore snapped. We are not going to indulge conspiracies. It's not a conspiracy, Rashad said, voice breaking despite his efforts to steady it. It's math. It's proof. It's logic. Harding put on an expression of pained disappointment. Rashad, I understand you're under pressure. Being one of the few students from your background at a school like Dunham can be overwhelming. Sometimes it can lead to misperception. The word hit the table like a slap. Your background. Not your talent. Not your work. Your background. A tactic as old as the institution itself. A teacher on the far left, Mrs. Carrington, a woman who had taught at Dunham for 25 years, crossed her arms. He submitted a paper anonymously, she said sharply. Why hide your name, unless you were trying to trap Dr. Harding? Rashad blinked. I submitted it anonymously so it would be judged fairly. Whitmore scoffed. Or so you could hide your intentions. Harding stepped closer to the dean, lowering his voice so only the front row could hear, though the tone carried judgment through the entire room. Sir, I don't want to see this young man punished. I think he needs support, not consequences. Support, as if Rashad were broken, as if he needed saving. Whitmore nodded solemnly. We'll take appropriate steps. Dr. Foster tried one final time. Dean Whitmore, we should examine the documents. If the Soviet paper matches, we're not giving weight to a teenager's internet find over a decorated professor, Whitmore said, tone final. We must maintain academic integrity. Rashad stared at the dean in disbelief. That's exactly what I'm trying to do. But he knew he was speaking into a void. Aldridge tapped the tablet again. Given the system logs, the grade discrepancies, and the disruption caused by the false accusation, we recommend temporary suspension pending further investigation. The word suspension echoed in Rashad's mind like a falling hammer. You're suspending me for being honest? His voice trembled not from fear but from the cruelty of the moment. For academic dishonesty, Aldridge corrected gently, almost sweetly. This will give us time to stabilize the classroom environment. Stabilize. Rashad repeated, stunned. I haven't done anything except point out the truth. But Whitmore was already rising. Meeting adjourned. Most faculty followed without looking at Rashad. A few glanced back with conflicted expressions, but none spoke. None risked themselves. Harding walked by last. He paused just long enough to whisper, You should have listened when I told you. You can't win. Rashad didn't look at him. He couldn't. He felt hollow as he left the room, the edges of his vision blurring. Students in the hallway glanced curiously at him. Some whispering, some pretending not to stare, but the news had already moved faster than his footsteps. By the end of the school day, the rumor mill was roaring. He hacked Harding's files. He tried to sabotage him. He freaked out in a meeting. He went after Harding because he couldn't handle the work. Every version twisted him into the villain. That evening, the suspension letter arrived in his inbox. Brief. Clinical. Final. His mother sat at the kitchen table reading it. Face blank. Voice quiet. We'll fight this, she said. We'll find out what really happened. But Rashad could see the worry in her eyes. The exhaustion. The fear of losing the opportunity she'd worked so hard to give him. He didn't sleep that night. The story began leaking onto social media the next morning. Not by Rashad, by students who had heard the meeting's fragmented retellings. But Dunham's administration was quick. Posts disappeared. Comments were locked. Hashtag shadowban. Anyone who mentioned Harding or the scandal had their content flagged for academic defamation. The school moved with breathtaking precision. Erase. Replace. Silence. But then finally hope. Rashad's cousin Kareem, a freshman studying computer science, texted him. Kareem, I found something. Harding messed up. He said too much in the faculty lounge. Someone recorded him on a work tablet. Rashad, what? Kareem. Voice memo. Harding admits he used that Soviet paper. Says no one at this school will ever know. I'm sending it to you. Rashad sat up straight in his bed, heart pounding. Proof. Real, undeniable proof. But the file never arrived. Instead, Kareem called 30 minutes later. Voice shaky. Bro, someone intercepted it. It vanished from the campus server. Just disappeared. And now Harding's office door has a new lock. Rashad felt the world shift beneath him. As Kareem whispered, someone inside Dunham doesn't just know about the recording. They're protecting Harding. And they got to the evidence before I could. The call from Kareem replayed in Rashad's mind on a loop. Someone inside Dunham doesn't just know about the recording. They're protecting Harding. That single sentence had pulled the last thread holding Rashad's trust in the system. If the truth wasn't just ignored but actively buried, then he wasn't just up against apathy. He was up against conspiracy. That night the apartment was quieter than usual. His mother sat in the living room, rubbing her temples as news alerts buzzed on her phone. None about Rashad yet, but the storm was coming. Rashad sat hunched over his laptop, eyes red from hours of research, thoughts flashing like static electricity. There had to be a way in. At 2:06 a.m. his screen lit up again. Kareem was calling back. "Yo," Rashad answered, barely breathing. Kareem sounded breathless. "I got it. I recovered the voice memo." "You serious?" "I had to rebuild it from the device cache. It wasn't wiped clean, just overwritten. Took hours."
What does it say?
"I'll send it to you right now," Kareem said. "But listen, it's short. 41 seconds. Harding is talking to another teacher, saying, and I quote, 'No one's gonna trace it back to that Soviet paper. I changed enough. This school will never know.'" Rashad's heart slammed against his chest. The file appeared a moment later in his inbox. Harding Lounge audio. He hit play. The quality was rough, muffled. Background noise. But then clear, unmistakable. "Ellison's a bright kid, but he's overeager. The paper I modeled the equation after. No one's gonna trace it back to that Soviet thing. I changed enough. This school will never know." Rashad exhaled slowly.
There it was.
Proof. And this time it wasn't going to disappear. By 4:12 a.m., the clip was posted on a fresh Twitter account. Rashad and Kareem made the decision together. No names, no tags, just the truth. They titled the tweet simply, "Dunham Prep Math Scandal. This is what happens when brilliance threatens power." The audio clip was attached. No context, just truth. The first 2 hours passed in silence. By 8:11 a.m., it had 3. By noon, it had, and by 5:47 p.m., Rashad was right was the top trending topic in the country. News outlets pounced. The Root, Vice, the New York Times Education Desk, BuzzFeed News, and even a guest segment on CNN's Race in America. Everyone wanted the story. The anonymous voice in the clip was quickly identified as Dr. Lewis Harding by alumni and former students who had heard his voice 1,000 times. No one doubted its authenticity. It was him, arrogant, confident. Rashad didn't leave the apartment that day. Neither did his mother. She sat beside him on the couch, phone vibrating nonstop with calls from cousins, friends, neighbors. But Rashad didn't feel victorious. He felt numb, because the clip wasn't a celebration. It was a confession. It wasn't just about him. It was about every black student who had ever been told they were imagining things, overreacting, ungrateful. Now the world was watching. But Dunham remained silent. The school locked its Twitter account. Comments were disabled on all official posts. Their website quietly removed Harding's faculty photo. No statements. No acknowledgements. Rashad watched it all unfold like a movie he didn't audition for. Then the calls started coming in from journalists. "Can we interview Rashad Ellison? Does he want to appear on a student justice panel? Can he speak on behalf of young black scholars?"
But Rashad didn't want to speak for everyone.
He just wanted his name back. By day 3, an emergency board meeting at Dunham was announced. But Rashad wasn't invited. Instead, he was told to remain home until the school's internal investigation concludes. They still wouldn't say his name, but they couldn't hide anymore. Former students began sharing stories. Anonymous posts poured onto Reddit, Medium, and Instagram. Dozens of black alumni recounted eerily similar experiences. Being excluded, receiving mysteriously low grades, having their work dismissed without explanation. Harding's name came up in more than half the stories. The silence had been cracked open. Rashad's mother turned on the television and sat next to him again. On CNN, a panel of educators discussed the clip. What this tells us is that racial bias in academic institutions isn't always loud. Sometimes, it's calculated, strategic, silent, and deeply, deeply institutionalized. Rashad watched quietly. Kareem called again that night. "Bro, you've seen the follower count on your burner account?" Rashad shook his head. "No. You're at 65,000 in 2 days." He didn't respond. "You changed something, man. People believe you now." That was the part that ached the most. Now, after audio proof, after humiliation, after public spectacle, They believed him now. But when he was standing in that boardroom, truth in his hands, they called him a liar. Still, the shift had begun. The next morning, Rashad's mother received a strange email. It wasn't from Dunham. It was from Winthrop University, one of the Ivy League's most fiercely competitive schools. The subject line read, "Invitation to engage. Academic opportunity for Rashad Ellison." She opened it slowly, eyes darting across the screen. Then she called him over. "You need to see this." Rashad took the phone. Read the email twice. The body of the message was calm, corporate, but unmistakable in tone. "We have been following the recent developments surrounding Mr. Ellison and are both alarmed and inspired by his resilience and academic integrity. We would like to formally invite Rashad to consider applying for early transfer admission to Winthrop's Advanced Mathematics program. Full scholarship consideration is guaranteed." His eyes flickered to the bottom. It was signed by the Dean of Mathematical Sciences. Rashad looked up at his mother. She was already crying silently, hands pressed to her lips. But Rashad wasn't smiling. Not yet. Because he knew this wasn't the end. It wasn't redemption. It was only recognition. And recognition came too late for too many. He folded the phone shut slowly.
"It's a good offer," he said.
But they only saw me because the world forced them to. Just as Rashad turned to sit back down, another email came in. This one from an anonymous address, with a single sentence. "They're rewriting the files. Check Harding's record before it disappears." The anonymous tip had barely cooled in Rashad's inbox when a new storm began to brew. Not online, but right outside Dunham Prep's iron gates. By Tuesday morning, the campus was surrounded. Students, parents, local activists, and former alumni, some masked, some not, stood shoulder to shoulder, along the perimeter. They held hand-painted signs with messages like "Protect Genius, not Power," "Math has no color," and "Rashad was right." Chants echoed down the sidewalk. "Where's the proof, Dunham? And you can't erase Rashad." From his apartment window, Rashad watched the live stream on his phone, the familiar red bricks of his school barely visible behind the crowd. But inside Dunham's polished corridors, the mood was frigid. The administration hadn't budged. The recording had gone viral. The news had broken. The tweets had shattered their silence. But still, Rashad's name had not been cleared. The suspension had not been lifted. There was no apology, no correction, not even a statement, acknowledging what the world now knew. Instead, a quiet but decisive blow came via email. Rashad would not be allowed to walk at graduation. He read the message twice, then a third time. His throat dried as his mother leaned over to read it beside him. "Due to the disruption and pending inquiry, we do not believe Mr. Ellison's participation in prom or commencement ceremonies would be appropriate at this time." The words were clinical, sanitized, cowardly. His mother's hands trembled with restrained fury. Outside, the protests only grew louder. TV crews started showing up by midweek. Dunham tried to push them off school property, but cameras caught students slipping flyers under the gates and holding signs through the bars. Then came the letters, hundreds of them, from parents, from educators, from professors at state colleges and Ivy Leagues alike. Each letter condemned the school's silence, demanded action, and warned of consequences. The faculty board went into lockdown, emergency meetings behind closed doors that students weren't allowed to attend. Inside those meetings, the tone wasn't about accountability. It was about damage control. That's when the headmaster broke. Late one evening, just after Rashad had finished dinner, the landline rang. His mother picked up, expecting another journalist. It wasn't. It was Headmaster Langley himself. His voice was slow, polished, overly careful. "Mrs. Ellison, thank you for taking my call. I realize your family is under considerable stress." Rashad watched from the couch, unable to hear the words, just the tightening of his mother's face, the way her lips thinned the longer he spoke. Langley continued, "We believe there's a path forward that benefits everyone. If Rashad could provide a short written apology, nothing too detailed, just a public expression of regret for the tone of the accusations, it would go a long way toward restoring community trust." Her silence was deafening. "And if this letter is read before the board's next press briefing, I believe we can offer re-entry into graduation activities, a reinstated diploma ceremony, even a commendation." Still silence. Then finally, her voice, "You want my son to apologize for uncovering the truth." Langley tried to recover. "I think we all understand the nuances here, and sometimes tensions cause miscommunication. This is about unity now. Her voice dropped into a cold, clear whisper. You want unity at the cost of integrity. Langley fumbled. Let's not turn this into something it isn't. But it already was. The next morning, a courier delivered the drafted apology letter, prepared by Dunham's legal team. It was 3 paragraphs long. It didn't use the word sorry. It used words like regret, confusion, and misunderstanding. It blamed the controversy on miscommunication between a respected professor and a high-achieving student. And it ended with a line meant to pacify the media. We move forward as one school community, united by our commitment to growth. Rashad's mother read it in full, standing in the center of their kitchen. Then she folded it once, walked out the front door, and didn't say a word. Rashad followed, confused, until he saw the camera crew setting up on the sidewalk. A news anchor from Channel 9 looked up as they approached. Mrs. Ellison, she handed the folded letter to the producer. I'll read this on air, she said. They adjusted the mic. Rashad stood behind her, heart pounding, unsure what she was going to do. The camera blinked red. The anchor nodded. Whenever you were ready. Mrs. Ellison unfolded the letter slowly, looked directly into the lens, and began. Dunham Prep would like you to believe that this letter represents healing, that it is a step forward, that it is meant to quiet the voices outside its gates. She paused. But this letter doesn't speak for my son. It speaks for cowards. She lifted it in the air. This letter doesn't protect students. It protects legacies built on silence. Then, in one crisp motion, she tore the apology straight down the center, then again into quarters, and let the pieces fall to the concrete. The anchor's eyes widened. Even the cameraman froze for a second. My son doesn't owe anyone an apology, she said. Your school does. The clip aired that evening and went viral by midnight. It wasn't just students watching now. It was the nation. The next morning, Rashad woke up to another email from a name he didn't recognize. Inside it was a subject line that made his pulse stop cold. I used to work for Harding. I kept everything. The email sat unopened for 3 minutes before Rashad could bring himself to click. Subject: I used to work for Harding. I kept everything. From undisclosed source at protonmail.com. Inside was a short message. I was Harding's research assistant for 3 years. He used stolen material more than once. I have copies of every draft. Meetings, emails, notes. They tried to silence me back then. But I'm ready now. I'll talk. Let's meet. Attached were 4. Each file was labeled with eerie clarity. Set theory draft Moscow org.gx. Grant app language flagged. .ee bet. Plagiarism proof correspondence.cheats. Rashad's hands trembled. It wasn't just a smoking gun. It was an entire artillery. By noon, the documents were in the hands of his new attorney. Her name was Amani Locke, a young civil rights litigator, with a track record for flipping school boards and breaking silence wide open. She arrived at Rashad's apartment less than 24 hours later, briefcase in one hand, fire in the other. You're not going to be the next story, she told him. You're going to be the last straw. She wore a sleek gray suit, with a Black Lives Matter pin on her lapel. When she spoke, every word sounded like a sentence in a courtroom, deliberate, unstoppable. The private hearing was scheduled for Friday afternoon. Dunham Prep didn't publicize it. They didn't invite the press. They didn't even confirm it to students. But the boardroom, usually reserved for high-level donor meetings, was filled with 14 people, deans, trustees, and senior staff. Langley sat at the head, his face carved in professional neutrality. Rashad entered in silence. His mother walked beside him, chin held high. And to their left walked Amani, cool, composed, with a thick manila folder in hand. Harding wasn't in the room. Langley cleared his throat. We appreciate your presence. This is not an adversarial proceeding. It is simply a discussion to resolve an unfortunate conflict. Rashad remained silent. Langley continued. Given the national attention surrounding this case, we believe the best path forward for all parties is a discreet transition. Dunham is prepared to assist Rashad in transferring to a highly reputable partner school, with a full academic endorsement. He paused. A non-disclosure understanding. To protect all involved. Amani set her folder on the table. No, she said. Langley blinked. Excuse me. We're not here for a quiet transfer. We're here for a public reckoning. Murmurs rippled down the line of trustees. She opened the folder and began sliding documents across the table. Here is proof that Dr. Harding plagiarized. At least 3 published works over the last 5 years, none cited. This is a transcript of a voice recording, where he admits covering the Soviet equation. This is the statement of his former assistant, now ready to testify under oath. Langley's voice thinned. This isn't a courtroom. No, Amani replied, but it will be. She laid down the last document, a formal complaint of academic discrimination filed with the Department of Education's Civil Rights Office. Unless, she said calmly, you'd like to handle this in-house, publicly, transparently. The silence was total. A trustee leaned forward. What exactly are you asking for? Rashad finally spoke. I want the school to acknowledge that what happened to me wasn't just a mistake, it was systemic bias. It was academic racism. A man near the back adjusted his glasses. Mr. Ellison, it's very difficult to prove intent in cases like this. It wasn't difficult when you suspended me without evidence, Rashad said, voice steady. Another trustee chimed in. What kind of acknowledgement are you seeking? Rashad looked at Amani, who gave a small nod. I want my name cleared, he said. Publicly. I want Dr. Harding's actions documented. And I want a formal policy change. A third-party equity review for students of color. I want something to change for the next black student who walks into your math department. Langley rubbed his temples. This school has a long-standing reputation, which is exactly what you've been protecting. Amani cut in. Not truth, not students, reputation. A tense beat passed, then another. Then, a door opened at the far end of the boardroom. Harding stepped in, but he looked different. Not smug, not sharp, shaken, disheveled. He hadn't been invited to the meeting, but he had come anyway. Langley looked furious. Lewis, what are you doing? Harding held up a hand, eyes fixed on Rashad. I just came to say, I'm retiring. A gasp moved through the room. I've submitted my letter. Effective immediately. Langley stood. You're not authorized. I've already sent it to HR. Harding interrupted. And I'm leaving campus tonight. His voice was thin, but it didn't shake. He turned, looked at Rashad again. I underestimated you, he said. And I'm sorry it got this far. Then he walked out. No apology, just a parting admission, wrapped in exit. But Rashad didn't feel relief. He felt something colder. Like the institution had made its sacrifice, and now, it would go back to protecting itself. Langley turned back to the room. This changes things. No, Amani said. It doesn't. She leaned forward. You still owe Rashad the truth, and the world is watching. The next morning, Rashad arrived on campus for the first time since his suspension, only to find Harding's office door wide open, ransacked and empty, with a handwritten note taped to the chair that read, You don't understand what you've started. The note left in Dr. Harding's vacant office haunted Rashad more than the man himself ever had. You don't understand what you've started. It wasn't a warning. It was a confession. By the following Monday, Harding's name had been wiped from Dunham's website. No farewell message. No retirement tribute. Just erasure. But his absence didn't clean the air. It thickened it. Because what Rashad had started couldn't be covered with fresh paint and silence. It was spreading. And journalists were catching on. The first major article dropped on the Chronicle of Higher Ed, a long-form investigative piece titled, The Lie Beneath the Ivy, Inside Dunham Prep's Legacy of Academic Gatekeeping. It opened with Rashad's story, but quickly widened its scope. A team of reporters dug through 10 years of student records, lawsuits, and local education board complaints. What they uncovered sent shockwaves beyond just the school. It exposed a method. Dozens of black and brown students had been flagged for underperformance despite strong test scores. Others had been suspended for disciplinary concerns, as vague as attitude or non-compliance. Several had quietly transferred after conflicts with staff. A handful of families had filed grievances that never went public. Most were silenced with settlements. But the worst revelation came not from paperwork, but from the janitor Rashad had seen outside that classroom, weeks ago. His name was Mr. Glenn Booker. He had worked at Dunham since 1994. He'd cleaned the floors of room 304 since Harding first stepped foot on campus. No one ever asked him for anything, until now. He called the investigative journalist directly, and what he said changed everything. There was a boy, Mr. Booker said, years ago. His name was Isaiah Clay. The name didn't mean anything to the journalist, but it meant something to Mr. Booker, and the story that followed was worse than anyone had imagined. Isaiah Clay had enrolled in Dunham in 2013. A sophomore. Black. Brilliant in math. Sound familiar? Booker remembered the boy vividly. Always working late in the study halls, scribbling formulas on scraps of paper, tutoring even older students. But within a year, Isaiah's energy had vanished. He started missing classes, getting detentions. Mr. Booker once found him crying in the locker room. No one listened to him, Booker said. He kept saying he didn't understand why his grades were dropping. I saw him carrying a project he worked on for weeks. Harding tossed it in the trash. The journalist asked if anyone had spoken up. No one dared. Then Booker went quiet, until he pulled something from the back of his old utility locker. A stack of leather-bound notebooks. They belonged to Isaiah. After his death, no one had claimed his things, so Mr. Booker had kept them. Inside were months of notes, proofs, sketches, equations, diary entries, personal pages that grew darker with each week. One entry, dated March 12th, he said my work was unoriginal. I used a theory I developed last semester. He told me to stop pretending to be what I'm not. Another, dated 2 weeks later. I think he wants me to quit. Maybe then I'll disappear and they can forget I ever got in here. Then the final entry. I feel like I'm screaming in a room where no one even hears my name. Isaiah took his own life just weeks after, and Harding had still been given a promotion the following semester. The article broke the story open. Other former students began stepping forward. One, now a software engineer, admitted he'd dropped out of Dunham in his junior year after his GPA plummeted, without explanation. I stopped speaking in class, he wrote in a public statement, because I realized they only listened when I was quiet. Another recalled being randomly selected for behavioral screenings, while her white peers were not. A former teacher, who'd left quietly in 2017, admitted to seeing grading patterns altered. We were told to maintain the curve. What they meant was keep the exceptional ones from standing out, especially the black ones. The final blow came in the form of a forgotten file. One of the investigative reporters gained access to old disciplinary records from the County Education Board, buried deep in a scanned microfiche archive. There, listed under a batch of 2014 academic interventions, was a sealed report from Dunham Prep. It referenced Isaiah Clay, and it included a notation that made the journalist freeze. Academic standing adjusted to reflect behavior. Recommendation: retain student in sophomore level courses. LH Lewis Harding. There it was, in writing. A buried document showing Harding had falsified a student's academic records for a student who later died. The police had been informed. A routine wellness report was filed at the time, citing student distress due to academic pressures. But no one had followed up. No one had investigated Harding. No one had even reviewed the grade records after Isaiah's death. Until now, the story detonated across every platform. Dunham gatekeeping scandal. From genius to ghost. The Isaiah Clay story. Rashad Ellison wasn't the first. He was just the first they couldn't bury. Rashad read each headline with a mix of grief and fury. He hadn't known Isaiah, but he knew the feeling of suffocating under the weight of institutional silence. And he couldn't shake the thought, that could have been me. Outside Dunham's gates, the protests doubled. But now the signs bore two names: justice for Rashad, justice for Isaiah. The school board released a bland, legalistic statement. We are aware of allegations involving past student experiences, and are launching an internal review. It was too late. The world had already seen what lay beneath the ivy. And then came a new twist. Quiet, almost too quiet. Kareem messaged Rashad a link to a leaked spreadsheet. I don't know who sent this, Kareem wrote, but it's from the school's old performance audit database. Look at column G. Rashad opened it. Names of students, classes, race, performance adjustments. And in column G, cryptic notes, monitor output, flag for attitude, defer rank. It was systemic, a formula built into the way Dunham processed students who didn't fit the mold, especially students who looked like Rashad. In the final tab of the spreadsheet, one last note appeared, one not meant for students' eyes. It read, confirm deletion of Clay Pi Ellison audit files before Q4 inspection. Do not retain originals. It was timestamped just 2 weeks before Harding's sudden retirement. The spreadsheet leak changed everything. In less than 24 hours, it was downloaded by over 5 million people, dissected by education experts, and broadcast in front-page headlines across every major network. The term audit flagging quickly entered national vocabulary, shorthand for racial suppression disguised as academic policy. The backlash was immediate, and this time, It wasn't just hashtags.
It was handcuffs.
Federal agents arrived at Harding's remote estate just past 6 a.m. on a Wednesday, the sky still heavy with morning fog. They walked past his rose-lined driveway, knocked once on the door, and arrested him without incident. He didn't speak. He didn't resist. But the image, Harding in a crumpled cardigan, wrists cuffed behind his back, was captured by a local journalist waiting in an idling car across the street. By noon it was everywhere. Dunham professor arrested for fraud, obstruction and academic tampering. Dr. Harding's legacy collapses under a decade of lies. From prestige to prison, how a teen exposed America's academic racism. The nation had moved beyond speculation. Now it was justice. Dunham Prep issued its first real statement that evening. Not from a spokesperson.
From the board itself.
It was read live on television by the chair of the trustees, a pale, trembling man named Joel Whitlock, who hadn't been seen in public since the scandal broke. He spoke slowly. We acknowledge that Dunham Prep has failed its students. We failed to protect those entrusted to our care. We failed to hold our own accountable. And we failed to act when the truth first surfaced. We are implementing an immediate independent investigation, restructuring our academic review board, and beginning a full audit of disciplinary records dating back 15 years. But the apology felt like ashes in Rashad's mouth. Because Isaiah Clay never got one. Because dozens of names were still lost inside sealed files. Because it took a national firestorm just to be believed. The next day, a helicopter flew over Dunham's historic quad, capturing the scene below. Hundreds of students, many dressed in all black, rising from their desks and walking out in silent protest. They gathered in front of the gates, sat cross-legged on the sidewalk, and held signs with two faces, Rashad's and Isaiah's. Above the crowd, one banner stretched high. A school that silences brilliance isn't elite. It's broken. By that weekend, Rashad's name was on every major news network. He wasn't a student anymore. He was a symbol of resistance, of exposure, of what it costs to tell the truth when no one wants to hear it. But he hadn't wanted fame. He hadn't wanted any of this. Then came the call from NBC Nightline. They were planning a live televised tribute segment titled, "The Future They Tried to Erase." It would air during prime time and close with a symbolic moment. Rashad would receive an honorary Dunham diploma, live, on stage, from a panel of black educators. Rashad hesitated at first. It felt strange being offered something after fighting so hard for what he had already earned. But it wasn't for him anymore. It was for every student who'd been told they were too much. He accepted. On the day of the taping, Rashad sat backstage in a crisp gray suit. His mother was beside him, straightening his collar. Cameras flashed as stylists brushed powder across his face and prepped him for the lights. It should have felt triumphant. But all Rashad felt was weight, not sadness, not nerves. Responsibility. Because even with Harding arrested, even with policies shifting, even with protests outside Dunham still growing, he knew systems didn't change with one story. They evolved when someone stayed to finish what they started. As he sat in the green room, 10 minutes before going live, a staff assistant entered with a thick white envelope. "It's for you," she said. Rashad looked down at it. No return address. But the handwriting was unmistakable. Slanted. Sharp. Controlled. Harding. The envelope was marked with a Department of Corrections stamp. Rashad stared at it, unmoving. His mother read the name and froze. "Do you want me to?" He shook his head. "No. I'll read it." He opened it slowly. Inside were 2 folded sheets of legal stationery and a Polaroid photo paper clipped to the corner. The letter began simply, "Rashad, I've spent 2 weeks in a place where silence is the currency, where no one is brilliant, where every name is stripped, and every mistake is branded permanent. And still, I don't think I understand what you've done to me." Rashad's eyes narrowed. He kept reading. "I built my life on precision, on control. But what I didn't account for was you. Not your mind, your refusal. Your stubborn, humiliating refusal to stay in the lines. I wanted to shape you, mold you, break you, maybe, but you didn't bend. You turned me inside out. And now, I live with that. You exposed something I wasn't ready to face, that I stopped loving math a long time ago. I started fearing being forgotten. And in that fear, I buried students like you beneath my ego. I will never say this again, and maybe I don't deserve to. But I am sorry." Rashad set the letter down slowly. His chest was tight, not with sympathy, not with rage, but with the weight of complexity. The photo clipped to the corner showed a young Harding, in his 30s, standing beside a black boy in a science fair, smiling. There was a note scribbled on the back. He was my first student. I failed him too. Rashad stared at the image. For a long moment, he felt nothing. Then everything. Because it was never just about one boy, or one genius, or one fall. It was about a system built to gatekeep, disguised as excellence. And for a moment, in the fluorescent green room, before the cameras rolled, Rashad understood the letter's true purpose. It wasn't redemption. It was surrender. As the stage manager called Rashad to the studio floor, another producer rushed in, breathless, holding a phone. "You need to see this," she said, panic in her voice. On screen was a breaking headline. New lawsuit alleges Rashad Ellison fabricated entire math-proof school sources. Pushback on hero narrative. The studio lights flickered back to full brightness, but the air had shifted. The headline still glared from the producer's tablet, its red ticker crawling with disbelief. New lawsuit alleges Rashad Ellison fabricated entire math-proof school sources. Pushback on hero narrative. Rashad stared at the screen. His chest didn't tighten this time. It didn't burn. It hollowed. "They waited until tonight," his mother said quietly beside him. "They timed it to ruin this moment." Amani Locke, seated 2 rows behind, was already on her phone. Anonymous plaintiffs. The language sounds like it came from a private investigator, probably hired by a group trying to rewrite the narrative. No names attached. No proof. Just fire with no smoke. The producer stepped closer. "You still want to go on?" Rashad didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his blazer pocket and pulled out the prison letter, the one from Harding. The weight of it had been sitting against his chest all day. He hadn't planned to share it. Now it felt necessary. "I want them to hear it," he said. "Which part?" "All of it." The studio went silent. 5 minutes later, Rashad stood under the lights, a spotlight on his shoulders. The crowd silent, the cameras rolling. The host introduced him. He's been called a whistleblower, a prodigy, and a threat to tradition. But tonight, he stands as a symbol of something much larger, a reckoning. Please welcome Rashad Ellis. Applause filled the studio. Rashad walked to center stage. The podium was simple, wooden, unadorned. On it the honorary diploma sat waiting. But Rashad didn't touch it. He looked up at the audience. And then he unfolded Harding's letter. He began reading aloud. "Rashad, I've watched the world bend itself around your name these last few weeks. And while the headlines have cast me as the villain, I want you to understand something. You didn't win. You simply embarrassed a man who spent his life mastering the art of control." Gasps rippled through the room. Rashad continued, voice even. "The system will forget your name faster than you realize. You are a storm, but storms pass. I built my reputation on longevity. You've built yours on disruption. And this country will always rebuild itself to protect the former, not the latter." Murmurs in the crowd grew louder. One cameraman lowered his head. "You didn't beat me, Rashad. You became the excuse they needed to bury what scares them. And when they're done using you as their poster boy, they will drop you and replace you with another version of the same old story." Rashad paused, then looked up. Those are the words of a man who spent decades gatekeeping the very doors he walked through, then tried to lock them behind him. He folded the letter and set it down. "But he wasn't wrong about one thing," Rashad said. "The system doesn't forget its protectors. It protects them until someone burns the blueprint." The audience went silent. Then Rashad reached into his other pocket. "I brought a second letter tonight," he said. He unfolded a smaller piece of paper. This one was old, faded. The ink slightly smudged, the edges curled with time. "This one," Rashad said, "was from my father. He died when I was 10. He wasn't a mathematician. He was a janitor at a university. He never saw me win awards or write proofs. But he saw something else." He glanced down at the note. "Son, if you ever get into a room where no one looks like you, no one listens to you, and no one wants you there, don't just stay. Stay and change the furniture. Rearrange the room so the next kid doesn't walk in thinking he's lost before he begins." Rashad's voice cracked but didn't break. He looked up. "And that's why I'm here." The applause started slow, one person clapping, then 2, then dozens. Not polite, not performative. It was heavy. Earned. And still Rashad raised a hand. "One more thing," he said, as the room quieted again. He turned to face the camera directly. "I've spent the last year proving I belong. But no student should ever have to survive to be believed. He stepped aside and motioned to a screen behind him. A new slide appeared.
The Clay Ellison Mathematics Initiative.
A national scholarship for underrepresented students in STEM, funded by Dunham Prep's severance payout, to Dr. Lewis Harding. A collective gasp swept the room. Rashad continued. I negotiated Harding's severance with the help of my attorney. Half of it, $200,000, was rerouted into a foundation named after me, and Isaiah Clay. Every year it will fund the tuition, mentorship, and research of young mathematicians of color, students who deserve to be seen before they are erased. At that moment, the studio didn't applaud. They stood. The crowd rose to their feet, clapping, crying, shouting. It wasn't just a speech, it was reclamation. But Rashad didn't smile. He stood still, because even as the room roared in solidarity, a quiet thought settled in his mind. Harding's letter was twisted. Yes, but not entirely wrong. Storms do pass, unless you teach the next generation to carry thunder. That night, as Rashad returned home from the taping, a package was waiting at his doorstep. No name, no return label. Inside it was a tattered Dunham yearbook from 1996, with dozens of black faces circled in red ink, and a note that read, "You're not the first to fight this. You're just the first they didn't bury." The leaves had just begun to turn on the Winthrop University campus when Rashad stepped into his first seminar. The lecture hall was cavernous, tall windows, sweeping beams, and the kind of silence that only came from generations of assumed excellence. But Rashad didn't walk in quietly. He walked in like he was building something. The Clay Ellison Initiative had launched just 3 months earlier, with applications pouring in from all over the country. It was already making headlines, but Rashad wasn't resting on impact. He'd chosen Winthrop not for prestige, but for confrontation. He wanted to test the limits of a place built on tradition. And on his first day, he didn't wait to speak. The course was Advanced Logical Structures, taught by Dr. Leopold Quinton, a renowned mathematician with 7 published books and the energy of a man used to being right. But halfway through a lecture on inferential proof theory, Rashad raised his hand. Quinton paused. Yes. Rashad stood up. Your framework assumes all logic must remain within fixed binary states, proof or non-proof. But in chaotic systems, that boundary isn't stable. There's an entire space between. Quinton blinked. And, he said, more curious than dismissive. Rashad walked to the board, picked up a marker, and drew a sequence, one that looped through classic topology, hybrid set logic, and a modified version of Gödel's incompleteness theory. The room went silent. Rashad capped the marker. You're teaching 1990s math to students who live in. No one said a word. Quinton smiled. Slowly. Then write something better. Challenge accepted. Within 6 months, Rashad published his first university paper, Dynamic Logic in Unstable Sets, a framework beyond benevolence. It sent shockwaves through the field. Professors at MIT, Stanford, and Oxford reached out. Conferences requested him. Graduate programs offered early access. But Rashad declined all of it. He didn't want to be platformed. He wanted to mentor. He started a late-night math lab in Winthrop's underfunded Black Student Center, where undergrads struggling in abstract logic courses found someone who saw their work not as inferior but misread. He didn't just tutor. He translated the language of math into something more than gatekeeping. He made it personal. One night, a sophomore named Kevin told him, "No one ever explained it like this. They just said I wasn't math material." Rashad nodded. "You are. They just weren't you material." By the end of that year, Rashad had mentored over 40 students, built a digital archive of anti-racist math pedagogy, and published his second paper, Erasure in Excellence: How Mathematical Rigor Becomes Cultural Exclusion. That one made people uncomfortable, especially the faculty. Emails trickled in from the administration. Tone it down. Let your research speak for itself. One donor threatened to pull their endowment. But Rashad didn't stop. By his second year, he unveiled a third proof, more radical than the first 2. It challenged the way prime factorization worked in predictive encryption systems. The implications reached into AI, cybersecurity, even quantum modeling. The paper was published under a new name, R. Ellison Clay. He'd never met Isaiah, but his ghost walked every hallway Rashad entered. One day, after delivering a guest lecture at Princeton, a renowned professor stopped him in the hallway. "I've read your work," she said. "It's not just brilliant. It's angry. And that's why it matters." Rashad didn't smile. He just nodded, because she wasn't wrong. He wasn't writing for applause. He was rewriting rules forged in the shadows of exclusion. But it wasn't all triumph. There were days Rashad felt the weight of legacy like chains around his ribs. Letters from other black students poured in, some uplifting, others painful. One girl wrote, "I'm not a genius, but I keep being told I have to be one just to deserve respect. I'm tired." Rashad sat with that letter for days, because he knew she was right. The system still demanded brilliance from some, mediocrity from others, and wrapped it all in objectivity. And so Rashad did something he hadn't done in a long time. He stepped back into silence. He returned to the original equation, the one Dr. Harding had written on the board at Dunham, the lie disguised as a challenge. He hadn't touched it since the scandal. But now, 2 years later, he pulled it up on a new whiteboard in Winthrop's mathematics building. Alone, late at night. And this time he didn't just solve it. He evolved it. He stripped away the plagiarism, stripped away the sabotage. He redesigned the problem into something transparent, something expansive. A system of logic that invited failure, included intuition, and made room for redefinition. He wrote and rewrote. And when he was done, he stepped back and smiled. Someone outside the room had taken a photo through the glass. The image showed Rashad, mid-motion, chalk in hand, the equation sprawling behind him like a mural. But instead of the final answer at the bottom, there was a blank space, where anyone could step in and keep going. That photo hit Twitter within hours. The caption read, "He didn't finish it. On purpose." The image went viral. Mathematicians called it a modern manifesto. Students called it an invitation. But Rashad? He called it honesty. Because math wasn't about endings. It was about possibilities. The next morning, Rashad received an invitation to return to Dunham as a guest speaker. The email read, "We've changed. We'd be honored if you'd see it for yourself." The Dunham campus looked the same. The ivy still curled across the stone walls like a secret language. The bell tower still rang with manufactured dignity. The uniforms were still crisp. The walkways still pristine. But the silence was different now. It wasn't heavy with secrets. It was expectant. 2 years after the scandal, the school's face had changed. The board had been restructured. 6 resignations, 3 firings, and a federal audit later. In their place sat a younger, more diverse body, including civil rights advocates, equity officers, and most surprisingly, 2 alumni who had once been forced out for academic dishonesty under Harding's watch. Their names had finally been cleared, and this time, they were writing the policies. The changes hadn't come quietly. Parents had protested the curriculum overhaul. Donors pulled funding. Some faculty resigned, calling the new direction political correctness dressed up as reform. But for once Dunham didn't blink. It stood firm. And that morning Rashad Ellison stood outside its wrought iron gates again, not as a student, but as a guest. The email invitation had been polite. Careful. "We would be honored to have you return for a walkthrough of our updated campus, and to provide input on our new integrity initiative. You are not obligated, but you are welcome." He hadn't answered right away. It took him 3 days to reply. "I'll come, but I'm not coming to forgive. I'm coming to see what you've actually built." The sky was overcast as he stepped through the gate, his name now engraved into the front-facing welcome board. Rashad Ellison, Distinguished Alumnus and Advisor, Clay Ellison Initiative. He wore all black. No logo, no fanfare. But as he crossed the quad, students watched him, some with awe, others with guilt, and some with gratitude they didn't yet have words for. He was greeted by Miss Jada Tramble, Dunham's new assistant head of school and its first black female administrator in over a century. Her smile was warm but reserved. "Thank you for coming, Rashad." He nodded. "Thank you for making it worth coming back to." They walked together past buildings he used to avoid, past benches where he once sat wondering if it was all in his head. He saw the remodeled math wing, its walls now adorned with plaques honoring past black scholars, including Isaiah Clay. A mural in the hallway read, "Brilliance needs no permission." Jada glanced at him. "We didn't want to just apologize. We wanted to repurpose the ruins." As they entered the faculty lounge, Rashad saw new faces, young black educators, Latino adjuncts, queer professors, teaching calculus, history, logic. For the first time, Dunham's brain didn't look like just one kind of body. A few alumni joined the tour, faces Rashad hadn't seen in years. Faces that had once avoided him in the hallways, turned away during his suspension, nodded politely during the worst days, and said nothing. Now they walked beside him with quiet shame. One of them, Marcus Rollins, stopped him in front of the old library doors. I should have said something, Marcus murmured. Back then, in class, when everyone just let it happen. Rashad didn't respond, because it wasn't about words. It was about actions. Marcus reached into his jacket and handed him something. A copy of Rewriting the Gate, Notes on Academic Racism, authored by Rashad himself. I use this with my students now, Marcus said. I teach at a community college in Baltimore, because of you. Rashad accepted it, and nodded once. Inside the new Equity Center, a room that used to be the disciplinary office, a large touchscreen displayed data from Dunham's internal audits, disparity charts, bias trainings, reports of student feedback on faculty behavior. The transparency was sharp, uncomfortable, but honest. Jada turned to him. We want the students to know the numbers. We want them to see what they're walking into. Then without ceremony, Rashad asked to go somewhere alone. The hallway to his old locker was mostly empty. The tiles still creaked underfoot. The walls still whispered in that same breathless way. But something was missing. Fear. He reached locker 287. The paint had been redone, the scratches erased, but when he opened it, he froze. Tucked inside, folded once, was a page, old, yellowed slightly at the edges. The top corner was torn, the same corner that had once been ripped in room 304 when Harding shredded his proof in front of the class. Rashad unfolded it slowly. It was his original solution. From the first week. From the trap. Except now, someone had circled the final line in red ink, and scrawled beneath it, "You were always right. I'm sorry it took me too long to say it." There was no signature, just the paper. And silence. Rashad stood still, the hallway echoing like a memory. He slipped the page into his bag, and walked on. As he exited the building, Rashad passed a wall of framed photos of past headmasters, and noticed one was missing. In its place, a plaque that read, "This space is reserved until the institution fully confronts who it allowed to lead." The auditorium was smaller than Rashad remembered. Or maybe he had just outgrown it. The same green velvet curtains still hung from the rafters. The same skylight still poured sunlight across the hardwood floor in slanted gold. But today the space wasn't heavy with silence or scrutiny. It was filled with students. And they were waiting for him. Rows of young faces, black, white, brown, curious, expectant, filled the room. They weren't just listening because they had to. They were listening because they knew the name Rashad Ellison before they ever walked into Dunham. He didn't stand at the podium. He stood in front of it. No microphone. No notes. Just his voice. People love to say brilliance has no race. Rashad began pacing slowly. But they forget who gets handed the benefit of the doubt, and who has to prove they belong. He paused. When I sat in one of these seats years ago, I was already a math scholar. I'd already won national awards. But the moment I stepped onto this campus, I was treated like a fluke, an experiment, a disruption. Several students nodded. Some clenched their jaws. They understood. And when I solved a problem I wasn't supposed to solve, he continued, they didn't celebrate me. They tried to erase me. The silence in the room deepened. Rashad scanned the crowd. But erasure doesn't work when you've got evidence. When your truth is written down. When your voice finds microphones of its own. Behind him, a mural now covered the once blank wall. It was a portrait of Rashad, not as he looked now, but how he appeared at 15, standing at a chalkboard, hand midair, facing an equation too large for the wall. But the chalk in his hand trailed off into light. Above the mural, painted in bold black, "Genius is not what you memorize. It's what you overcome." Rashad looked back at the students. "I didn't stay in this fight to be famous," he said. "I stayed because too many others were pushed out before me." He clicked a small remote in his hand. The screen behind him lit up with a list of names, hundreds of them. The Clay Ellison Scholars. Students from all over the country, young black mathematicians, scientists, coders, theorists, each one supported by the initiative he built from the ashes of his own fight. "Legacy isn't what people remember you for," Rashad said. "It's what changes because you existed." Applause built slowly, not clapping for spectacle, but for recognition. After the assembly, students lined up to shake his hand, take photos, ask questions. One girl with deep brown skin and thick braids handed him a note that simply read, "You made it easier for me to stay." Another boy said, "My dad said he used to be scared of schools like this, but now he tells me to take up space." Rashad listened, thanked them, encouraged them. But when the crowd faded, he stayed behind. He walked the empty halls alone. Not out of nostalgia, out of responsibility. He stopped outside the classroom door was open. New desks, new books. A young black professor stood at the board, erasing a lesson on abstract variables. He turned and saw Rashad in the doorway. "Didn't expect you until the panel tonight," the professor said, smiling. Rashad stepped in. "Just wanted to see it." The professor nodded. This room used to feel haunted. Rashad's eyes scanned the space. "Now it feels rewritten," he said. The professor turned back to the board and picked up a marker. "I've got a new equation I'm thinking of trying next week," he said. "Want to test it out?" Rashad smiled. "Only if it's solvable this time." They both laughed. As he turned to leave, Rashad caught a glimpse of the small brass plaque next to the doorway. This space was once a trap. It is now a launch pad. He walked back toward the quad, the sky soft with evening light. The mural caught the sun at just the right angle now. But Rashad didn't stop to stare at himself. He looked toward the main gates. Students were filtering out for lunch, backpacks slung, voices rising in bright conversation. And then he saw him. A new student, black, short hair, oversized blazer, nervously clutching a math textbook against his chest. His eyes darted across the courtyard as if trying to read every rule before breaking one. He looked exactly how Rashad had felt on his first day, lost, bright, alone. The boy stopped outside room 304, hesitating. The professor inside looked up, saw him, and smiled wide. Then said loud enough to carry, "Come in. Today we solve something real. If you've ever felt unseen, unheard, or underestimated, this story was for you. No one should have to be a genius just to be treated with dignity. But until the system changes, voices like Rashad's matter more than ever. Type yes if you believe every student deserves to be seen. Subscribe if this broke your heart and opened your eyes.